All right, shall we continue? Where are we?
We can.
I've got obviously more content which we're not going to go through right now. Which is all about how to actually get some of those graphics straight out of, say, LaTeX, but it's in the slides. We rather talk a bit about sonification now, because so far we've done speech, which is good for math, but it's not necessarily all you need for graphics, where you can use additional information and additional means to make things understood. So as humans, obviously, we have a limited capacity for speech understanding. So if you're just trying to listen to multiple conversations at once, or you've ever tried to listen to your audiobook while reading a news article, you realize at one point, you can't do both. And therefore, it's useful to have effectively other modalities that enhance your experience that you can get with speech, and sound is the obvious one. Well, we've already seen that things like tactile graphics, for instance, help, but sound is another one. Just sound that you can have on top of speech or that enhances your speech. In particular, we have more sound channels in our brains and also in that physically, because we can go through the bones as well as through the ears, in terms of listening to things, which allow us to get more information in parallel about what we see or not see, for that matter. And there's a number of things a lot of you might be used to and might not even know it or realize anymore that you get that information through sound. So there's things like auditory icons, earcons and spearcons. What are these? Auditory icons are generally things like real sounds that kind of make sense and represent what a particular object would really do. So you get sounds in computer systems, you get sounds for whoosh sound for sending off an email, or you get some sort of a grumbling paper sound when you empty out the trash can on your desktop, and so on and so forth. So that's auditory icons. Earcons, on the other hand, are kind of synthesized sounds which allow you to understand what's currently happening in your system. Classical one is the arrow peep, which already in old computers, when you booted them up, you didn't have a keyboard in there. It would start beep beep and so on, and so it couldn't even boot. And you still get some of these arrow peeps today. Other classical ones and well-known ones, for instance, the Windows startup sound. Everybody knows that. Everybody knows, you open the Windows, there's this chime sound, and therefore you know that somebody's just started up their Windows operating system. What are spearcons? The idea of spearcons is to have kind of some little bit of speech, which is associated with a particular action or with a particular informative element. So, for instance, saying something is a link or an image is some sort of a spearcon, which often is being kind of added as a suffix in screen readers, but also you can speed these things up to a degree where you can't even discern them properly anymore, because they are kind of information that you immediately recognize what it is, rather than the actual information of, where does the link go to? Is information which might be different for every link, whereas that it's a link is the same everywhere. You can always say very quickly in a very high rate, link, 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 and you don't even have to recognize that it's a word anymore. It just gets associated automatically, or at least after a while, so you know what you have to do on some of these elements. And just to point out, these definitions vary in the literature. They're not set in stone, so particularly of people kind of slightly define earcons and auditory icons differently. Right, so that's one way. Another way, and that's more important for us, is that sound can be data-driven. That is, I'll take the actual data that I want to convey, and I'll then use and make something out of it that sonifies the data. And so a classic example are auditory graphs, and then you can use all kinds of advanced sampling techniques using multiple frequencies, multi-channel input and also soundscapes and various advanced auditory techniques in order to put more and more meaning into what you're trying to convey with the sound. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Right, so we're having a look at sonification, and I'll show you a few examples, and then I'll show you exactly how it's being done. And so what methods are there? There's primarily two methods. One is called the scanning method, and the other one is a probing method. And as as the name suggests, scanning method is kind of a colloquial one, a predefined way how to sonify something. So that means that the data that's in an image is sonified in some sort of a sequence that is determined by the data. Whereas a probing method is then that you have some interactive way of probing things. In other words, the user can actually choose what they want sonified and possibly also how they want it sonified. And then there's a mesh of the two, which is kind of a windowing technique where you allow kind of probing or scanning on a particular sub-element, which you can define or can be user defined. And I'll show you a couple of examples. One of the nice ones is in Bruce Walker's diagram report. Bruce Walker does a lot of work on sonification. So here's one. Here's a line graph, and doesn't have any additional information. All it does here is so what did we hear? Well, we heard the line graph, and the sound went down where the graph was descending. Where it's ascending, the frequency went up, and then it went down again where it was descending. Right? Let's listen to it again. Right. So that gives you some sort of information of roughly how the curve could look like, at least if you're getting used to it. I mean, there's studies out there that say that sonification is very difficult to learn, and it's actually not for everyone. But at least it gives you some idea how that works. Now you can add more channels or more information channels if you like. So what Bruce has done here is he's added a kind of the extrema, which is meaning that the topmost of the graph as well, the bottommost of the graph are being explicitly drawn into the diagram, as well as more information along the x-axis. And you can now start sonifying that, and that's quite interesting. So we have now along the x-axis, we have values 9, 10, 11, and so on, which correspond to time. And on the graph corresponds to money for some reason, with a minimum of 10 and a maximum of 84 and a median of 50, or average of 50, or no, median. Oh, the start point, sorry, is at $50. And let's see how that sounds now. Right, so those little drum beats you could hear, what they were effectively the ticks along the x-axis. So if you start counting, it starts at 9 a.m. and goes all the way to 6 p.m. You can listen to that. It's 9, 10, 11, 12, at 1 o'clock, 2, and so on, right? So that gives you roughly an idea how the graph pans out over time. And then what else is there's one where we include the y-axis. On the y-axis, remember, is the dollars, and the dollar is like going up from 10 to 84. Let's listen how that sounds. I have to admit, I'm not quite sure what he's trying to convey here. What I can assume is that we have the $50 is kind of the start point. When it's below the $50, you could kind of hear the low secondary sound, and then the higher secondary sound is when it's above. Let's listen to that again.
I think when it starts rising, he puts that.
Ah, much better interpretation than what I have here. Right, Bala, could you repeat that, please?
So it's basically showing the slope. Okay, if it's going down, he doesn't put it. If it is going up, he puts it. So he starts at 11 and up to 4 p.m. he puts that.
Or I think it's between the minimum and maximum points we hear the sound.
Yeah, means, but it's just giving a direction. So minimum and maximum is everywhere, it's minimum and maximum. But it hits a minimum and goes to a maximum.
So in other words, mathematically it shows the second derivative. Is that right?
So he's basically modulating both frequency and amplitude, or it's only frequency? I think it's both frequency.
I think it's both. Yeah, it's not. Let's see that again. Hear that again. Yes. So there's a yeah. You're absolutely right. It is the ascending and descending which is expressed here with the y-axis sound. Let's put all three together. I'll listen to that. Right, now we have the x-axis, the y-axis, as well as the actual graph. And I have to admit, at least I have already trouble kind of distinguishing two. Well, not distinguishing them, but kind of getting meaning out of both two sounds together. Three makes it very difficult for me, but I know it's not the same for everybody. And also, for instance, there's a group in Italy, in Milano, they build kind of games, math stylish games for children, where you start with one line and then you start after a while with 2 lines and 3 lines and kind of trying to distinguish how many shapes and what the shapes were in what you've heard. And that does help a lot if you train your ear to listen to some of these things. Right, so there's a bunch of work out there. There's quite a number of these elements, which of these tools which allow you to visualize as well as sonify some of these graphs. And we'll have a look at some of these examples, of course, as we usually do. So one is the graphics accelerator from SES, which I'll show after I've showed the Desmos or demo. So Desmos high charts does something similar for SVGs. We've seen high charts before, so let's not look at those again. Let's look at Desmos. Desmos is a graphics calculator which is available partially free. There's a premium product, of course, as well, and that allows you to do sonification. And let's, of course, for some reason this points to localhost, which is wrong. Let's just go to their site. There you go. There's a calculator. And let's see whether we can get x squared to work. So we've got x squared there. And I think it is, what is it? Right. So Alt T or Command T brings up a menu in which you can have the screen reader activated as well as listen to the graph. Let's listen to the graph. So that was x squared. I'll make it a bit louder. Speed a bit higher. Oop. Let's add another graph. That's always a nice one. What about cosine of x? And let's, what was it? Alt T. Let's listen to that. Hold on. That's a bit slow down a bit. Right, let's make this make this a bit wider so we can actually hear something of that, right? So I'm make it like this. So I'm now making the parabola a bit wider, and I have the cosine in there, and let's listen to that again. So that was the cosine now. No, that was the parabola I've listened to, right? Yes. And you could hear these two pop noises. And these two pop noises were the intersection points with the cosine. Well, let's hear again. Let's try whether I can, get both to work at the same time.
So Volker, this is only a web interface, or it is somehow possible to integrate it into a document?
That's an interesting question. Of course, it's always possible to integrate these things. Let's have a look at, hold on, do I have, let me move to, let's move to a different browser where I have Equatio running, for instance. So these are my slides. Let's go to, and here's the graph editor. And that's Equatio, and that contains the Desmos graph editor. Right, so we can do exactly the same trickery in there. Let's use for the fun of it, let's use the sine function. And of course this is, and I believe we can also sonify it in here. Let's do Alt-T. Oops, nope, that doesn't like me. Why not? Auto trace on. Hold on, yes. So that should work. Is the auto trace on? So how do I trace that now? It says auto trace on, but for some reason it doesn't want to play it. What's happening here? Huh? Yes, so trace it, please. Go on. What's going on? Yeah, so for some reason it doesn't like me. Auto trace on. Let's trace. Where's the tracing? Anyway, I don't want to waste too much time not figuring out how that works. I remember I had it running at some point, maybe on a different browser, maybe on a different platform, maybe on Windows. Yes, so the answer to your question, sorry about that. The answer to your question is yes, it can be integrated. It can be integrated into documents. It can be integrated into other apps. The only problem is that if you, unless you use their free version online, you have to effectively pay a license. That's their business model.
Hello?
Yes, Akila, please.
Can you press H? I just checked the Equatio documentation. Can you press the letter H?
H. Oh, yeah. Yes, I can, but it doesn't do anything. Why not? Thank you. That it's sometimes useful to read the manual, not throw it away throw it out straight away. Yes, I'm not good at reading manuals, I have to admit.
No, but Volker, my question was, let's say if the rest of the document is in some format, whatever it's HTML or whatever it is, how does it interface with the audio?
How does it interface?
Like how I have a document.
Well, it effectively it sits in there as a small web application, right? Okay. It sits in there as you have similar to integrating, say, these chemical diagrams into the page. You have effectively a bit of JavaScript, and you have a bit of and you have the front end in there as HTML or SVG or whatever it is. I think that Desmos draws on the canvas element, so that's obviously in every browser, and this is the way this is being integrated. I would have to ask I know the people at Desmos, but I would have to see again whether this can be integrated offline as well.
Okay.
That is, I'm not sure.
Volker,
Online
but,
certainly,
well,
because obviously you can always request things from their service, but on offline, I don't know.
Akashdeep has something to say. Akash?
yeah, Volker, like even in online, how I will integrate? It's like there's something CDN which I can like
But
some sort of JavaScript.
all of these things, in many ways, they can be integrated into single web documents, and just to show you a web document where some of these things are integrated. We have my. I think I've showed that to you before. So, for instance, there's the diagram report where I've integrated some of the math. Which you can straight away explore. You've the
Volker, your audio is not coming. Your audio is not coming. No.
Hello?
Now it's okay.
Hello?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Damn it. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Yes. We can hear you.
Now we can hear Volker.
Hello?
I think he can't hear us now.
No, we
Hello?
can hear you. We can hear you.
Oh, now you can hear me again. I can't hear you though. So sorry, for some reason all of a sudden Teams told me your microphone doesn't work anymore. And so you could hear me in the, oh, somebody's in the chat telling me you can hear you. Thank you. Sorry. Where were we? Yes, I was just telling you about how you can integrate all of these things into a single web document effectively. Here's another one. That's a Dutch company, or the non-profit that talks about works with schools and universities in the Netherlands to make documents accessible. We've put together a gold standard with them, for instance, for these accessible diagrams. And what you can see here in the page are straight away some of these accessible diagrams integrated, and you can navigate them. And all of that is obviously spoken in Dutch.
Screen sharing, please.
Of course. Thank you. Right. Let me show that site again. So this is the Dedicon website, Huidigennis, which it's kind of the gold standard of how to make chemistry accessible in the Netherlands. And here are the chemical diagrams, and they're being explained, and here you can start navigating them, and they're being spoken out in Dutch, of course, so we don't have a Dutch voice, or I haven't switched on a Dutch voice now, but otherwise you could hear the Dutch, and you can go to the next one, and so on, and you have multiple ones on the page, and you can put them wherever you like. And it's in many ways like any other component of your document, and you can do similar things with the calculators. For instance, Desmos Calculator has an API that allows you to straight away integrate it into your website and so on. As I said before, not sure how that really works offline. These diagrams, for instance, work offline if you have a JavaScript interpreter available, and similar math checks, for instance, works offline. However, you have to have a local installation or have to have all the JavaScript in your integrated into your site, which can be quite large when it comes to math checks. For these diagrams and for that, most of these small navigation things, it's all very small. So for instance, the slides I'm showing you, that has all of these fully integrated into the slides, with the exception of math checks, obviously, because that's far too large. So though they work offline with the exception of the math. Anything else I wanted to show you? Right, yes. It's kind of the final part is now. I'll show you how you actually do this. Right? So how do you do that technically? How can you do it on your own for your own little for your own data, for your own graphics? And that's actually very, very simple these days. So the way it works is using what's the new Web Audio API. So the Web Audio API has been around, it has been specified for nearly 10 years, I believe. But in terms of implementation, it's only been around for the last few years. So I think Firefox implemented it in 2016. I might be wrong. Let's not get bogged down on the actual dates, but it's been fairly new in Chromium-based browsers, WebKit, and Blink-based browsers. What you can do is you can use simple oscillators, for instance. A simple oscillator you can get within an audio context. Audio context is one of the major parts of the Web Audio API. There's other parts, but we'll just concentrate on that for now. So you can get an audio context, which gives you all the functionality in order to frequency modulation, rate, pitch, any of these things. And there you can just grab an oscillator, create an oscillator which lives in that context. And then what you can do with these oscillators, you can use them in order to allow you to modulate a wave, a periodic waveform with the frequency over time, right? And how do we actually do that? Purely mathematically, think about it this way. What we have is data, right? What we have is two-dimensional data. So think about your graph, think about this curve that we want to sonify. All this is, it maps x values to y values. Consider the x values as something, a function over time, and the y value is just a function which we want to model as a frequency in these time values. So what you have is you have a path which is given by a number of, say, n+1 xy coordinates, and then we use a suitable scaling function, right? That kind of maps a particular value. In that case, it maps a particular data value, y value, into a frequency. Right? So let's call that scaling function sigma, and then we define a base frequency as the frequency on the first data point. So that is then f naught is equal to sigma of y naught, so the first data point in our n+1 data elements. And that automatically then induces a frequency modulation over the set of these y values, because every fi is then going to be equal to sigma of yi, right? And then we do the same thing by having a second scaling function, a tau, let's call it tau, and we define those over the time intervals. And the time intervals are automatically given by the x values, so x naught to xn, and then we have an intervals from x0 to x1, x1 to x2, and so on and so forth, right? So we have n intervals, and these n intervals can then be modulated in time intervals by just saying tau of xi is equal to ti, right? So think about it as you have your first interval is, say, x is from 0 to 1, whereas your second interval is from 1 to 5, right? That means that your function tau, the first part, the length in which you want to model it, say a second or say 2 seconds, so everything should be done in 10 seconds. So the tau maps your first interval from 0 to 1 to 0 to 2 seconds, right? And then tau maps the second interval, which goes from 1 to 5, from the second 2 to the second 10, right? So then you now have, you have the frequency, the first frequency being played over 2 seconds, and the second frequency being played over 8 seconds. Right? And that's what you then input into your oscillators. And these oscillators, then you create effectively n oscillators over these for these time intervals, and you play one after another, and they set in effectively that you start them and they set in at the particular time they're being created for, the particular interval, and they stop once the interval is over, right? And that automatically gives you a smooth frequency modulation over the entire path. It's straightforward as that. It's about 10 lines of code. The result is obviously fairly crude, and I'll play you for that particular for this algorithm I've just told you. I'll just play you a couple of examples in a second. But just let's have a think about what the result is. Well, the result is fairly crude because all you do is you do frequency jumps between these y values, right? So you have something high, something low, something high, for instance, and there's no smoothing between those parts of the curve. So think about more of partial functions which jump, right? Kind of step functions rather than a smooth function. So you can apply smoothing as well as you could, instead of using simple oscillators, you might want to use something like a pleasing external sound, something that has been synthesized from an instrument rather than from just kind of a peep, effectively. And right, and doing it over the entire path obviously gives you a scanning method. So it just plays the entire path. You can then start thinking about probing methods in order to do more user interaction by, for instance, combining that with an interactive exploration model, as we have seen on say some of the diagrams earlier. And let me give you an example with these oscillators, which doesn't sound great, but just to give you an example how that looks like. Again, this here is a time series. And the time series has been extracted or generated, the graph of the time series has been generated from R out of a statistical model. And I'm not going to switch on the screen reader because otherwise we get too much sound. I'll just walk into that. And so it gives us a It's a long time series, and it sounds horrible, doesn't it? And the problem is that time series is anything but smooth. So it's really, really choppy. And in many ways, this is what you could hear, if you could hear it, is that, that you chomp with the frequencies a lot up and down, and it really doesn't give you much in the way of understanding what the graph looks like, because it's really not a graph that's suitable for it. So let's zoom in onto the graph and see whether we can hear a bit more. So you might have heard, effectively what you see here is kind of, it goes up and then down and up and down and up and down a bit. But it's still, in my opinion, you still can't hear a lot. But let's go to the next segment just for the fun of it. Well, I feel at least you could hear that towards the end you were, it went fairly far up and you were in many ways higher than at the beginning. But as I said, these sonification, and this is kind of to show a little point about sonification. Sonification works fairly nicely if you have nice curves. If you have something that's nice and smooth, say a sine curve, a parabola, anything like that, you can actually make something out. Whereas on something like, this is a fairly fractal curve there. I personally believe it doesn't really work very well. And some of the user experience, some of the experiments that a lot of other people have done for sonification seem to suggest similar. I'll show you a final example where it works hopefully slightly better, and that is on box plots. and what it does here.
Can I interrupt?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so in the previous graph, it might have worked better if that interval was smaller, right?
Yes, if you that's right. So I haven't put that here yet, but if you kind of zoom further in onto the graph, you get you get more of a you can discern more that you're going up and down. Yes, you're right. It also does help a bit if you spread it out a bit over time. So in many ways, there's a lot of parameters you can play with. Let me just show you this one, because this one is a bit nicer because it has, which is close to your point in many ways. It has less data points it tries to convey. So this is a box. This is a box plot. It's not a box plot. It's a histogram. Sorry, it's a histogram with a distribution of air quality over time, and that's and it's effectively a bar chart, and the way it's being sonified is by making effectively a curve out of the different bars. Let's zoom in. So I'm not quite sure whether you. So if you listen close, you can get the idea that there's I think 10 bars. Let me count. No, it's 9 only. There's 9. It's higher at the beginning and it clearly goes down towards the end. And you could possibly also hear that there was a little pause, meaning that there's for one value there are no samples. Right. So that's the last one where. Something went wrong here with my sonification. Sorry, let me try again. Right, so in the end, you could hear, or you could not hear, that there was a bar missing in many ways, right? Well, as I said, sonification is something people really have to train on, and it's not a straightforward thing to do, but by all means, for those of you who are inclined to play around with these things, there's I've given you the basic algorithm, and it's fairly straightforward to implement in JavaScript with the Web Audio API. By all means, go ahead, play around with it, and then try, smoothing. There's smoothing functions you can apply, which makes things a lot nicer. Obviously, as Akila pointed out, parameters like narrowing down windows in order to recursively dive into into graphs and reducing the number of data points that you actually sonify helps. Playing with the frequency, playing with time and rate, and yeah, so there's all kinds of things. Well, the outlook is in many ways. There's a lot of more advanced content out there, which needs to be made accessible. Think about data simulations, proper simulations, teaching simulations, where you want to teach kids or students something by playing with simulations. We looked at some of them already in the light of statistics. Other things are, of course, more interactivity. We've seen some of the interactivity, how that can be made accessible in things like Equatio, but also Desmos, for instance, allows you to switch on the screen reader and so on and so forth. And there's serious games. So a lot of teaching these days in particular is done with games. I've just been up, actually, I am currently at a conference, Web for All conference, which was yesterday and today. Yesterday, Greg Gaze there showed really nice games they were playing in order to get students onboarded in lab situations. So where you kind of could start walk around and get information on what is around you in the lab. Where are the, they were talking about an auto shop lab, but they can do the same thing with chemistry, for instance, or with experimental labs for physics or electric engineering. And there's a lot of advanced work that one can do on the basis of some of the stuff I showed you throughout the lecture. And yeah, well, that leaves me to thank everybody for attending and paying attention. And I hope I'll see you all again one day in person in India when I'm actually allowed to travel again.
Thank you. I think it's open for questions. So, and I will also request that all the people who are attending today should definitely fill up our survey form, feedback form. And also I will send it across to those who could not attend today. So these lectures have been sponsored by the Spark program. And it's important for us to give them a feedback on the workshop. So that's part of the, yes, requirement for us to give. So I would request all of you to give us some feedback. Of course, any questions, please. So Volker will be here for some more time, so we can.
So Volker, this is Shankar here. This sonification is really interesting for many of the students who would like to have some kind of a STEM-based, career. But does it require even something more to be taught, like how to understand this and all that? How do they do it in England and anywhere? People teach them what does it really interpret, and then take them to this kind of a books or accessible content. How do they take them there?
So Shankar, I'm sorry, I can't tell you how it is in England. I know this is always very bad because
any of the countries you travel, yeah.
Yeah, most of the we've done some experiments with students here. I've done some experiments with them, but that's not really a representative or statistically relevant. What I think what often happens is that companies like SAS is, for instance, a company that one of their business models is data sonification, and they do seminars on it. They actually have people traveling around and teaching people in detail. So obviously, because they ultimately want to sell their product, and therefore they give courses on that. I understand that I've talked to some people in the US who are teachers in special needs schools, and also they also do similar things. So they teach their kids, how to listen to certain things and how to do sonification. As I mentioned, our colleagues in Milano, Christian Bagheretti and Sergio Mazzaretti and Dragan Abramovic, so they work on these games, which you can play on a tablet, which you can play on a normal mobile phone, and which teach you kind of to distinguish different sounds in order to figure out different forms and different graphs and so on, and that also helps, and that's aimed at school kids primarily.
See, we have come across also Volker devices which actually people wear to get basically an image of the surroundings. These are sonification devices, actual physical devices. But at least my own understanding is the type of training that is required is quite high, in terms of being able to understand. And now just like we saw this, so the important thing will also become what is it that one is interested in a graph like this. Okay, let's say if there's a complex graph like the one we saw, if let's say more interest is to get the peaks, how many peaks came or what kind the peaks came, it's going to be a little harder in sonification compared to other techniques like tactile and so on. So so it is, I think, has clearly there's a lot of research and a lot of work that had happened, even because we also know people who use these sonification devices for even looking at obstacles or looking, for navigation, because they can actually understand the distances at which various obstacles are there. But I think, is a high training. And also, I think ears are also much more customized in the sense that what type of frequencies, how do you relate to them? Are you sensitive to what type of, so that's a little bit more complex than even touch.
Yeah, I think, but on that point, I think the important thing is not to say, oh, sonification is the thing to do, and it has to be done like this. I think the important thing is to give people options. So you have, and that's what I've been trying to get across with in the lecture, is that once you've got the semantics, the information in your diagram, in your formula, in your document, you can create so many different alternative forms out of it, or formats, that it allows you to make things, to sonify things, but also to screen read things. So these time series I showed you, you can also screen read them. It tells you roughly kind of what the data points are and all these things. Once you have that information in there, it really, it opens up a world, and there's so many. Not everybody can deal with sonification. Not everybody can use tactile. Not everybody, even people who are blind, some of them can't read Braille because they're turned blind late in their life, and so on and so forth. So there's never one solution that fits all. And however, the more information you have in the page, the more different solutions you can create, and which might be personalizable for the particular user. Sorry, but Akila, you raised your hand.
Yeah,
Piyush also wanted. Akila, yeah. Then Piyush. Yeah.
I wanted to ask if there are any libraries which we can use to generate the semantics for SVGs. Like if it detects the square, it says square. Something that makes the manual process simpler instead of us having to do everything from scratch.
Yes. So we do have something for which primarily works on chemistry, but also works to some extent on physics diagrams. But as I said, there's always a knowledge component in the background, which does the basic recognition of lines, columns. So I didn't go into any of these details. That would have been another lecture. That goes kind of understands basic lines, characters, circles, and things like this. And then depending on what the domain is in which you want to interpret it to, it then makes an interpretation for that. For instance, if you have chemistry, it then kind of says, well, these are double bonds. If you have physics, it would say, oh, well, this, these wavy lines is a consistor, or whatever they're called, and this rectangle is a battery, and so on and so forth, or transistors. Sorry, and yes and no. So, but there are no other libraries I could think of at the moment. But that obviously would be something, this is, so what we have is a kind of a generic library, and it would be nice if somebody wanted to add additional knowledge-based modules to it. That's always possible.
Piyush?
Yes. Okay. So sir, my question is a bit broader. In the sense, I'm trying to visualize we've learned about various tools and solutions which can be used for STEM documentation, reading STEM documentation, making them accessible, etc. So obviously, as you said, that we should tell the people about the various options which are available, and they can choose and learn according to their capabilities and their understanding. But at the same time, in India, like I would say more than 90% of the youngsters, the point is, because of the limited opportunities, a majority are not have not reached a level where they can themselves start going to the next stage. So I'm trying to visualize, like, if we see primary education or the secondary education, what is the tool chain or the set of solutions or the set of tools would look like, so that these students can start making use of these things. I'm not very clear in my question, but yeah.
No. I fully appreciate your question. I fully understand as well the problem. There's kind of this disconnect problem, right? Where you think, okay, so we've got, and I'm not sure about the situation in India. I know the situation, for instance, here in Europe, but also in the US, that there's a lot of, tools and things and toy things out there for primary school students. But then there's a certain disconnect, right? A certain disconnect where you go, there's not all that much for intermediate ones, and all of a sudden, then there's a lot of tools out there for mediums, medium difficulty math, and then advanced math, right? And how do we bridge that gap? And there is the problem that in many ways, most of the tools that really work for math don't necessarily work that well for math a low-level high school teacher would be able to create, because they don't really understand themselves, what LaTeX is. They don't understand any of these things. I think tools like Equatio, for instance, but also maybe Desmos, etc., are quite instrumental on that level, because they allow people to at least, express some things more easily, which is a lot harder if you have to first study LaTeX, for instance. It also does help that now things like LibreOffice and also Word, you can export some of those elements, the math equations, into useful formats. So in many ways, I feel it is something. It's not really just for the kids, but it's also for we have to educate the teachers to use the right tools, and also to learn about what they have actually done, because so I'll give you this is anecdotal evidence, and that comes from this work we've done in the Netherlands, where a high school teacher gave us an entire Word document full of chemical formulas and structural formulas they wanted to have represented in the gold standard. All right. That's great, but it's all images. Do we have to do image analysis on all of those? Which works, but it's error prone. How did you draw those? Well, I used ChemDoodle or ChemDraw or something. It turns out that instead of just exporting JPEGs and putting those into the Word document, she could have just drawn things, kind of pulled things over there, and then it would have contained the entire mol file, which is kind of the chemical specification in the background, which we can then straight away exploit and make things accessible in no time, right? And so most people don't even understand what they have and what they're working with, and that's something that's important to get across as well, right? If you draw if you draw in a particular specialist software program, why don't you export the full data? Why do you only export a bitmap image, which throws everything away? That's what, and so there's a lot of education that has to go into that, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yes, Shudari. Sorry, I'm probably slow.
Yeah, so I also have the question around SVG navigation and parsing that we are discussing. So is it screen reader reading out all the information, or is it the SRE doing that?
Sorry, I don't understand. I didn't understand that. No.
My question is it SRE or screen reader reading out those SVG?
Oh, those SVGs. That is, the technique is effectively that the navigation happens in the browser. There's a little bit of JavaScript magic in there, which just the connection between the shadow DOM I showed you and the SVG. And the actual text to speech is then being done by the screen reader. But the screen reader doesn't know about it, because all we do is we push this into an ARIA live region. And thereby the screen reader sees an update and reads that out. But the screen reader has no clue of what it's reading. So the screen reader doesn't really do anything, the navigation or anything of that nature. So in many ways, if the screen reader tries to do something intelligent on the SVG, you have to switch that off. And that's what we do. We use it as